Welcome to 12 Rules for What? My name is Sam. I'm joined, as ever, by
Alex. Hello.
Hello. And we are very happy to be here with Cam and Andy, who are two Australian anti-fascists. And we're going to be talking about the Australian far right. You can there's a great blog which we will link in the show notes where you can get a huge amount of information. We'll be we've been digging into this over the last few days. We've learned an enormous amount about the Australian far right, its significance for the global far right, and in some, I think, quite interesting ways, its similarities and differences with the British far right. Obviously, the two countries are very closely culturally linked. So we'll kind of be thinking about the relationship between these two things and Australia's significance for the global far right, and whether or not it's kind of the source of some of the things that are kind of flowing around this kind of disgusting milieu that we spend our time researching or not. So the first question that I wanted to ask.
Oh, wait, the blog is called Slack Bastard.
Sorry, Slack Bastard. Sorry, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
And the radio show is called Yeah Nah Pasaran, and you can get it as a podcast as well, I think. So definitely check both those things out.
So the first question is just a very simple one, kind of in some ways autobiographical, but also obviously, without kind of doxing yourself. How did you guys first start to come up to researching the far right or be involved kind of more broadly in anti-fascism? Was there a single kind of trigger? Did something happen in the Australian far right that triggered it? Or is it a more kind of gradual engagement?
I guess for me, it was one specific event in around 2003, I think it was. There was a group in Australia called the Patriotic Youth League who had started trying to recruit on university campuses, and they were also doing postering campaigns around sort of multiracial suburbs in Sydney. And a friend of mine lived in one of those suburbs. He said, this is a bit off. You got a bunch of little old ladies to go out and scrape all the posters off. It was a good time had by all. But they also had this website, which was really stupid, if you can imagine. And we thought we could make our own website for them, just taking the mickey. And so we came up with our parody version of their website, which was all pretty silly. But as soon as we put it up, we started getting death threats. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get a death threat for making some dumb joke, maybe I should just get death threats for a good reason. And so we started sort of really having a look at who these people were and what they were actually about.
A Web 1.0. We made our own website to parody another website. Kind of seems quite antiquated now, I think.
Yeah, very old-fashioned.
And Andy, I'm much more aware of your history just because I've been following you for a fair amount of time. How did you get involved in doing this kind of stuff?
Well, I think in my case, it probably extends a bit further than Cam. So I guess you could say I began to take an interest in politics generally and radical politics while I was a teenager. And in Melbourne in the 1990s, there was a group called National Action, not to be confused with its UK equivalent. And they were, in the mid-90s, they had set up headquarters in a suburb of Melbourne called Fawkner, around which there was a campaign to essentially close it, which was eventually successful. But also at that time, they were quite active in Melbourne, in various parts of Melbourne. And I guess as an anarchist who was active during those years, there were a series of encounters, let's say, between members of National Action and other neo-Nazi activists at that time. And so it became a kind of, a useful thing to do, to pay attention to the far right. And then later, along with Cam, I guess, one of the ways in which we expressed those politics at the time was through another website called Fight Them Back, which was launched at the same time as there was a coalition formed between members of similar groups in Australia and New Zealand, or Aotearoa, and it was thought at the time that it would be useful for anti-fascists to organise in order to combat this, binational attempt to establish fascist politics or re-establish fascist politics in the online domain in the early 2000s. So, I guess I've always had a general interest in political ideologies of one sort or another, and was given particular reason to pay more attention to the far right in the, early to mid 1990s.
We want to kind of dig into the history of the Australian far right. In a recent blog post, you linked to an article called "The Rise of the Fascist." I can never say this word. Is it cadre or cadre? I want to say cadre, but people around me say cadre. It just feels weird. I'm going to go with cadre. Go the majority opinion. What do you reckon?
I'm with you.
You're with me? Okay, cadre. We're going to go for cadre. Yeah. Okay. The Rise of the Fascist cadre. That's how it's spelled. That's how I'm going to read it. Jordan McSweeney writes that there's been a kind of move from mass movements to political parties. And then as those two things have failed recently, there's been a kind of shift towards constructing fascist groups, the fascist cadre. Do you agree with that kind of recent history of the Australian far right? What can you say about the kind of perhaps the far right in Australia since Reclaim Australia? And is that the kind of general tendency it's moved through? Mass movements galvanizing into political parties, those political parties having kind of diminishing returns as they become, their kind of stunt making doesn't really transform into electoral growth or anything like that. And then a shift into these more kind of hard parties, extreme movements, or kind of non-movements, like extreme kind of groupsicles, really, like NSN and so on. Do you agree with this history, or is there something you would kind of add to it or supplement it with?
I think it's generally fairly sound. I think in terms of the recent history with Reclaim and so on, what I witnessed was the emergence of dedicated fascists. They emerged as the kind of leadership of this movement. And I guess I'd be somewhat wary of describing it as a mass movement, because I think relative to other social movements in Australia, they're relatively small, but certainly aspire to, develop a mass. And it's also understood, I think, on the part of, convinced fascists that they need some form of their own organisation, call it a cadre, call it what you will, which will act as the kind of essentially a vanguard, a political vanguard that will give political direction to these movements, which are often composed of people, I think it's in terms of Reclaim and also to some extent in terms of the current anti-lockdown movement. There's a lot of people who are have been discombobulated by one thing or the other and are seeking direction, but are not characterised by having histories of political engagement. So they're relatively ignorant, relatively naive. These characters emerge as and present themselves as a kind of vanguard. And that worked for a period of time. I think the critical factor in terms of the recent history is the reliance upon social media to establish a platform to cultivate a following. And that was relatively successful. If you look at the Patriots Front, which consciously styled itself as the vanguard of Reclaim Australia, I think at its peak it had something like 160,000 followers on Facebook. And some of those would have been from places other than Australia, but many weren't. And it was a very effective tool for propaganda. But to what end? And as the stunts kind of, the political benefits of engaging those sorts of stunts, they have some benefit, but really the task is to cohere a group, a solid group that can then kind of capitalise upon this sentiment and leave something behind. So there's always this kind of aspiration to build something from popular resentment in a way that leaves behind some kind of trace and can then be used when things become, more favourable to them re-emerging. And I guess the other thing is that it was a kind of loose coalition of dedicated fascists and neo-Nazis, along with Christian fundamentalists. So there was a certain kind of a very strongly opportunistic angle as well. It was understood that at the time, and I mean, it's still the case, but at that time there were various campaigns going on to, for example, stop the construction of a mosque in a rural town in Victoria and various other places across the country, and a kind of widespread sentiment which can really only be understood in the context of a broader context of the war on terror and the attempted criminalisation of essentially Muslim life. So it wasn't just the case that you had small groups of fascists and neo-Nazis agitating about it, but in the Australian Parliament, there was all sorts of talk about the problems that Muslims as communities pose to national security and all sorts of other things. So the circumstances were, I think, favourable to the development of these sorts of groups, and what they gave expression to was a latent kind of sentiment, and that was what they were trying to capitalise upon and to create something of lasting value as far as they're concerned that could carry over after the hubbub about the Lint Cafe siege, which was December 2014, the various other kind of spectacular moments of violence associated with Muslims that they wanted to seize upon and build upon. And to some extent, there's always a tension between mainstreaming, the extent to which these convinced fascists can participate in political parties, can influence them, obtain positions as staffers and so on. You'll find a similar kind of situation with the initial emergence of One Nation in the 90s. There were, obviously every, radical right-winger flocked to One Nation. Here was someone who was, as she portrayed herself, this is Pauline Hanson, prepared to speak on behalf of the common people and express, common sense objections to, at that time in the early mid-90s, was Asian immigration. We need to stop the Asian invasion, as it was called, which again echoed the sentiments that were expressed in the 80s by groups like National Action. Stop the Asian invasion was one of their key slogans, and that had some resonance. Then, years later, it became, stop the mosque. So there's always this kind of adaptation that takes place on the far right. And I think it would be wrong to kind of underestimate the degree of calculation or the dynamism that's often displayed by these groups and movements. They do seek, popularity. They do want influence. And there's this kind of sense in which they are prepared to experiment with various techniques, forms of rhetoric that are going to provide them with an audience and eventually, seek to radicalise them and have them actually embrace. This is the broader population that has kind of everyday, let's say, or average concerns in ways that are amenable to the growth of an actual fascist movement and actual fascist political organisations. And they've met with, some degree of success, I suppose. If you look at a figure like Pauline Hanson, well, that's one. You also have Fraser Anning. But I guess in this context, it's also important to note that the Australian electoral system, which operates differently to the British and others, is it relies upon preferential voting. So it's much more possible for mainstream parties to absorb challenges from minor parties. The real effect, I think, is the way in which agitation on the part of fascist and racist groups can encourage more straightforward expressions of racism on the part of the political mainstream. That's also one of their kind of key goals, one of the ways in which they attempt to influence the national discourse. And when that ends, there's always, these sorts of debates always take place on the far right, as they do in from other political perspectives. How important is it to compromise one's principles in order to obtain some semblance of power, and how important is to stick to one's principles to maintain, a public expression of a commitment to a white nationalist politics. And those sorts of kind of debates and discussions happen, and there's a kind of, a constant back and forth among different groups and individuals about how best to, pursue their politics and to meet with whatever degree of success that they might encounter.
might just add about our electoral system that, as well as allowing for mainstream conservatism to sort of absorb the anxieties that informed groups like One Nation and sort of peel off that vote, we also do have a little bit of a lucky dip system in that sometimes random parties just get elected based on very few votes, which does make things a little bit interesting sometimes.
What do you mean, lucky dip system? It sounds an absolute mad way to run a democracy.
We have
that's in the upper house, yeah.
We have preferential voting in the Senate, which does allow for minor parties to swap preferences. So they can give out instructions for, if you want to vote for this party, this is how you should vote. And the way that those preference deals can be structured can sometimes result in someone with maybe sometimes just 10 votes total getting elected to the Senate.
Extraordinary. I mean, so the things you were saying there, lots of them are kind of have equivalents in the UK, kind of approximate equivalents. The UK Conservatives, have been also historically very successful at absorbing the far right and speaking to their concerns, but not producing a kind of an out-and-out fascist party in doing so. There's also kind of interesting comparisons there between like Patriot Front that you were talking about, maybe like Britain First has a massive online social following, but really kind of lacks strategic direction, really kind of lacks a sense that there is any kind of endpoint that can be kind of found that they're definitely aiming for. Do you think there are any realistic strategic endpoints for the Australian far right? Like what? Because in America, for example, you have the presidency, and it's not implausible that you could elect a far right president, and that's a massive, significant transformation in American political culture. Is there something of that scale equivalent for the Australian far right that they are aiming towards, or not? And is the kind of the movement between these different modes of organizing, movements, if not mass movements, political parties, cadres, and so on, like, is the movement between these things because there isn't an endpoint?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think there are relatively limited opportunities, but I guess what I think about is the kind of broader history and the ways in which the far right, with some exceptions, perhaps in the 20s and 30s, which is, almost a century ago, there's been limited space for the development of a kind of white nationalist politics, to the extent that that informs, most, fascist ideologies in countries like Australia and elsewhere. For most of its modern history, the state had an official policy known as the White Australia policy. And in that sense, the kind of grounds upon which a fascist or white nationalist movement or party might develop was quite limited. And that wasn't because there was an absence of those ideas or those practices, whether a state policy or, in an informal sense, that had already been adopted